Thanks for joining us for Ruth Institute's podcast. Our website is www.ruthinstitute.org. We seek to change the narrative around marriage and family to create a cultural climate favorable to lifelong married love. We also seek to promote recovery and healing from the wounds of the sexual revolution and share our stories with the next generation. I encourage you to visit our website, where you can sign up for our free e-newsletter and receive more information on what we're doing around the country and how you can be involved. Here's one from our files. Jennifer Johnson is a guest on Dr. Robert Oscar Lopez's podcast, Cogwatch. They're discussing divorce, freedom, and family.
Welcome to Cogwatch 31. This is the 31st in a series of podcasts dealing with gender and sexuality out there in the popular culture. And I am your usual host, Robert Oscar Lopez. I'm an associate professor of English out here in Los Angeles. But today I am joined by a member of the Testimonial Council of the International Children's Rights Institute, and she's also an associate director for the Ruth Institute, led by Jennifer Roback Morse. She's a contributor to Jephthah's Daughters, which was the volume of essays on children's rights that the ICRI published last year, edited by me and Rivka Edelman. Thank you very much for joining us today, Jennifer.
Hi, Bobby. How are you?
Very good. I mean, Jennifer Johnson is she's a very good friend, and she also did us proud when she went to Paris to speak at the second annual ICRI conference on divorce. And that's what we're talking about today, because divorce seems to be one of the issues that falls by the wayside. It comes up from time to time when people debate gay marriage, but it as an issue in and of itself, it seems to be often neglected in popular discussion. So first, let me ask Jennifer the first question, which is if you can give the listeners a sense of where the discussion stands about divorce. Who's talking about divorce? Why should people talk about divorce? And why is it a problem that we don't talk about it more?
I don't think very many people are talking about divorce. It seems like the only ones who are talking about it are those who have been negatively impacted by it and who have connected the dots between divorce policy and some negative effects and some agony and pain that they've experienced in their lives. A lot of people just haven't really connected the dots, I don't think, and I think that our wider culture has embraced this idea of divorce as a type of freedom. So when you equate divorce with freedom, it's hard to get people to walk back from that and to look at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, I could relate to that. Now, but you said that there are not many. Is anybody talking about it, or is it really just totally off the radar?
Well, at the Ruth Institute, we talk about divorce quite a bit. But, it's really disappointing how many defenders of traditional marriage, people who you normally think of as strong defenders of traditional marriage, are quite silent on the issue of divorce. I personally find it very disappointing how few of them are willing to speak out about it.
Well, and there are some important points I want to just mention because I think it's relevant to this. First of all, Jesus did speak directly about divorce, and so this is a major sin, according to the New Testament. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what I think is so difficult when we have Christians who are rightly opposing gay marriage and gay parenting, but they ignore Jesus' very clear words in the New Testament.
Right now, and I did notice, I backtracked a couple articles, and I found that there have been studies that show that evangelical couples are just as likely to divorce, or in some studies more likely to divorce, although Brad Wilcox mentioned that more recent studies show that if they do actually go to church, and particularly if the male in the couple goes to church every week, the rate of divorce does go down. But it is somewhat, what statistically can you tell us in terms of the state of divorce right now across the country? Is it as bad as people sometimes say it is, where they say most marriages end in divorce, or has it been improving? What would you say?
Right now, the current research is indicating that divorce rates are a little bit on the downward trend. In fact, I'm having computer problem because I would try to pull up studies right now, but I can't get my computer going. But it seems to me that that is what the current research is indicating, and I'm not sure how much of that has to do with marriage rates also declining. So there might be a correlation there.
Well, that was what I always wondered about. I mean, I always supposed that one of the reasons why evangelicals had really high divorce rates was because they got married when somebody got pregnant. And if you have the convenient out of saying, well, nothing in my worldview precludes me from having an abortion or just, not getting married even though I've been having sex with someone, then you're less likely to get into a marriage that might be easily strained. You know what I mean? So I think you have to take it in context. Does that make sense? Or?
Oh, yeah. The whole issue of sex inside versus outside of marriage and abortion and all that, it's all interrelated.
Right.
These are all sexual issues, I believe, that we're dealing with. They are certainly not isolated issues at all. I think that I have an intuition that there's actually quite a bit of sexual immorality within the Christian churches, and I include my own church. I'm a Catholic. I include Catholics in that as well.
Right.
I think that there's a lot of sex outside of marriage going on, which is obviously being propped up by contraceptive use. And so I think that when you're dealing with quite a bit of sexual immorality and essentially a redefinition of adultery within the Christian community, then it's hard to have a witness against other things such as gay marriage. It makes it really hard.
Right. Well, I'm with you on some things, particularly the fact that I am really tired of talking about gay marriage in so many ways. I think that gay marriage was used, and maybe you can tell me whether you agree with this or not. I feel like it was used as a wedge issue and as a deflection from both sides. I think people on the left used gay marriage because they didn't want to talk about the disastrous impact that divorce has had on children across the whole country. So it's much easier to get people talking about something much more shiny and abstract, which isn't actually going to affect nearly as many people as divorce. And then I think on the conservative side, they didn't want to have to look at their own divorces and what's going on among conservatives and among Christians, which is where they've been pretty bad about maintaining their marriages. And so
Right.
Do you feel like it was used as a deflection?
I'm not sure if it was used as a deflection. I mean, maybe, but I would probably spin it in a different way. I think that my own opinion, this might be quite radical, I think that gay marriage is actually a subset of radical leftist feminist ideology. I think that we can trace a history of gender neutrality going back to at least 1977 with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her contribution to a publication called Sex Bias in the U.S. Code.
Right.
She's been a really, really strong supporter of gender neutrality within the legal code, and of course the Equal Rights Amendment was a big part of that. So my opinion is, this is definitely not mainstream at all, but I think that gay marriage is really a Trojan horse for this push for gender neutrality by what I call the radical feminist left. How does that sound to you? Does that resonate with you at all? What do you think?
I think so. I mean, I found myself increasingly, I was just like you, I was involved pretty heavily in the debate about gay marriage, but I found myself once I got into 2 years, 3 years really being immersed in the thick of it, feeling like as much as I oppose gay marriage, which I do, and as much as I see a lot of disastrous impacts of it, I just felt as though it was such small beans compared to the bigger picture, which is the complete decline in what I describe to my students as the gentlemanly and ladylike culture of the 1950s, when there was a real clear guidebook for men and women about how to conduct themselves towards each other. And I think part of what I suppose is that there was a kind of traffic accident in history where there were real legitimate concerns from women about their ability to get educated and to be able to be paid fairly for work outside the home and to be, to be fairly represented in the legal system on issues like domestic violence, etc. So those things had to be addressed, but it coincided with the sexual revolution that was really driven by men wanting to do what they want. And instead of women trying to look for ways to temper this radical leftist male energy, they felt that they could equalize it by just making women as promiscuous as men were. And it didn't work. And that's why no-fault divorce started in 1968, 1969, and you had shows like The Brady Bunch, which popularized and romanticized the idea of the blended family. And so there was kind of cultural cover for it at the same time that all of the negative effects of this on women, I think, were hidden and camouflaged. And I want to go from there then to asking you about your experience in Paris. You presented a very interesting paper when you were at the conference in Paris on October 10th, 2015. And in that one, you did make a very clear link between the gay marriage arguments and the problems with divorce, and you did this through an analysis of something that Masha Gessen had said. Can you tell me a little bit about what that paper was? And
I came across the words of Masha Gessen a couple years ago, and she essentially is arguing that children need multiple legal parents, that the legal system needs to accommodate this idea that children should have more than two parents. And she makes a very clear connection that marriage blocks that. Marriage is two. Marriage is a man and a woman, which is two, and marriage blocks that goal of hers. And she goes on to state that her children have five parents, more or less, and essentially saying how great it is and blah, blah, blah. And I read that, and I thought to myself, oh, my gosh, she has no clue what she is advocating, because I had five parents. I had two natural parents, and I had three step-parents because of divorces and remarriages. And so I went in and I wrote that essay saying, first off, my conclusion was that she was a hypocrite because she herself had a mother and a father. She herself had, more or less an intact, what appears to be an intact arrangement. And her own children are, being shuttled about between these five parents, and she just doesn't know the chaos, the confusion, the lack of a cultural or genetic identity that two biological married parents provides to a child. I think that type of argument is really, it's not an anthropological argument. I think that we are on the side of anthropology. We can use anthropological type concepts in order to advance what we believe, and I think it's the other side now who has moved away from the anthropology of the human person.
Well,
I don't know what reader or which listeners might think of that, but that's how it looks to me.
Well, to me, I can completely relate to your argument because I also had five parents. The gender configuration was a little bit different because my mother was same-sex attracted. But if you look at all of the after the divorce, all the remarrying and new partners, etc., I had actually even more than that. So I completely agree with your argument, and I think divorce and gay marriage are both cultural changes that impose upon children the legal requirement to obey and to love all of these people who are not their parents and who more often than not in life as we live it are people who are somewhat unwelcome as an authority presence in the child's life. That is to say, if you're asking the legal system to tell a child you have five parents, each of them has authority over you, you have to love and obey them. I mean, that's really what these movements are asking for. I mean, they're not just asking for your right to provide a home and to cook and to make sure that the kid gets to basketball practice. You are placing a legal requirement that child has to obey you. And really the implicit thing there is you have to behave like a loving child. And, the way that most people experience it, I learned this when I was doing all the interviews for Jephthah's Daughters, is most children don't really want this other non-biologically related person in their life. I mean, it makes sense because of the experience we had with divorce and with step-parents and with blended families. I remember when you and I were both at the conference in Notre Dame, and I posed to the audience, I said, how many of you have step-parents? And then they raised their hands, and I said, how many of you call your stepmother mom? And nobody raised their hand. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah,
I think we're always telling, in these circumstances, we're definitely telling children who to love, and it's really, really offensive. And, I had a stepfather who was kind. He was a good man, and his family are all good people. But I'll be frank with you, I would have really rather that my own parents stay together and me not have to deal with that complication. And on my dad's side, I had two stepmothers, and the first one, I don't know what was going on with her. I think she just had a lot of internal issues, and I'm not really sure. We didn't really have much of a relationship. The second one, I had more of a relationship with her, but still, in both cases, I really didn't want them in my life. And it's not like they ever yelled at me or beat me or anything like that. They didn't, but I still really didn't want them there, and I kind of resented being required to love them and accept them, and I think that we're constantly telling these kids who they have to love, and which is so ironic, given that the whole gay movement, they're always shouting, "Stop telling us who to love."
Right, I know that's the biggest thing. Yeah, that's the biggest thing. That's the biggest thing that gets to me is that if the gay marriage movement was founded on the core principle that you can't tell people who to love and you have to respect relationships that are already in existence. Well, what relationship is more important than the relationship you have to the two people who conceived you? And why should you tell someone that they can't love the parent that conceived you, and instead you have to love this other person who's being imposed on you because of something the adults in your life want? I mean, that to me was always the biggest contradiction that I saw, and I think it's a huge contradiction. I don't think it's a small one. I think it's a real problem. Now, when you presented this in France, what did you think of the other presentations? I know you don't necessarily speak a lot of French, but tell me what you got from the other presentations, like from the therapist who talked about marriage therapy and the educator and the lawyer.
Well, I don't understand French, and so I can't speak directly to the presentations, but I can tell you this, and we all met afterwards, and we had that little snacks and some champagne, and we chit-chatted for a while afterwards, and I did get to speak to a couple of them, and they do speak a little bit of English, and I was so moved by their dedication to the family, by their dedication to children's rights in this particular issue that we address. I love how in France, they had 1 million people come out to defend marriage. I believe that was back in 2013, right? And you were a part of that.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, when I heard about that, my esteem for the people of France just shot absolutely through the roof. I was blown away, and I thought, we have about 5 times more population here in the U.S. compared to France, and they got 1 million people in the streets. We couldn't get 1 million people in the streets. There's no way we could do that here. I mean, it would be great if we could, but I don't think people really care. So I was so moved by their love of this issue and their commitment to it. I will always love them for that. So.
Yeah, and one of the things one of the things that I loved about what happened in France was the churches were really, really behind them, whereas I feel like in the United States we were constantly hemmed in and hamstrung by the wishy-washy level of commitment from the churches at every step of the way. That's what I perceived, was that people didn't want to talk about it at the pulpit. They didn't want to talk about it at Sunday service. They didn't want to talk about it on Christian radio. They kind of avoided it as much as possible because they didn't want to be attacked. Whereas in France, the Catholic Church was very strongly behind them.
Right. I think that here we could say fairly that the Mormons were very clearly in our camp. But yeah, but as far as other denominations being so clearly in our camp, I think you're right. A lot of them were stepping out of the debate. They just didn't really want to get involved.
Yeah. Well, when you look at the larger landscape, I know in preparation for some of the presentations I've done, I went back and I looked at some of the popular culture as it evolved in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and we're really up against a very tough cultural tide on the divorce issue. That's hard. You did have a lot of movies that were made in the late 70s, like Kramer versus Kramer and Ordinary People, but implicit in the script was always the idea that the divorce is inevitable and the divorce is the best thing to do, and so the children just kind of have to learn to adapt to it. And then in the 90s, we had movies like Mrs. Doubtfire or the remake of the Roald Dahl story Matilda, where it was very explicit. The message at the end of the films was, the people who love you, that's your family. It doesn't really matter who your biological mother and father are, which is a beautiful thing to say to an orphan who was adopted, right? But the reality is that most of the people affected by divorce, they weren't orphaned. It wasn't the fact that one of their parents was a widow. It was the fact that their parents didn't get along and they broke up, and then they got other people involved in their life, and the kids being shelled around from house to house, and it's really unfair. And so it's cold comfort to tell children in that situation, when you're the one living through it and you see that the parents made the decisions that they made based on what they wanted, it's cold comfort to tell the child, oh, it doesn't really matter who your biological mother or father was. It's just whoever loves you. And to a certain degree, it's globally imposed narcissism. It's like our entire ideology about children is based on the idea that if I love a child, that's what's important, not whether the child actually loves me back. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
I've found people who are insisting that biology doesn't matter, they all have a mom and a dad who are married.
Well, they often do, yeah. But I also come across the people who they're very defensive and protective of what their parents said. I think the people who are the most defensive are usually, or the most protective of that ideology, typically tend to be those who were adopted. But that's a whole other podcast. I mean, we have to deal with that somewhat separately, right?
Right, yeah.
I think divorce, adoption is another one that gets thrown kind of as a smokescreen, but I think it's such a different set of issues from divorce, although a lot of divorces end in step-parent adoptions. But we know from Cinderella and that myth and all of those stories going back all the way to antiquity of the evil stepmother that, it doesn't always work out for kids when they're under a step-parent adoption, right?
Well, there is something actually called the Cinderella effect, and it's named after that story, that kids in step-parent households undergo more abuse, more sickness, more hospital visits, and things of that nature. So it's a real thing, and it's certainly not to say that every step-parent is horrible. It's not that at all. But the risks are elevated when you have non-related people in the household. That's just a fact.
Well, because, and thinking about stepmothers, because I have had to deal with a number of stepmothers because of what happened after my parents split up, I feel like there is something very, very powerful that connects women to children that they've given birth to. Because that is such an intense experience. We know from science that the DNA from the infant is even found in the brain of the mother who carried the child, etc. There's a really strong connection there. And when you have a stepmother, it's very hard because, especially if she has other children who are your step-siblings that she gave birth to, it's very, very hard. I love my father's wife, his current wife, my stepmother, but I could never call her mom. It just could never happen. And I know going to his house that is not my house. That's very clear to me when I go there. I love her. I love my dad. I love my step-siblings. But I know when I go there that is not my house. That if something were to happen to me and I were homeless in Los Angeles, I could not move back to New York and move into that house. And I think that's the sort of baseline that so many stepchildren have to deal with, which is the fact that they don't really have that unmitigated, unconditional home, and I think that's where a lot of those statistics come from about what you're talking about, the Cinderella effect.
Well, I think that, I think it's fair to say that when you're a child of divorce, you don't really have a family, because a family is one. We think of a family as one, and children of divorce don't have that. When they're in the one parent's household, they have to act as if the other parent's household and family doesn't exist. And then when they're in that parent's household, they have to act as if the other parent's household and family doesn't exist. Okay, that's not family. That's not a feeling of family. That's not a feeling of unity. That's divisiveness. That's imposed divisiveness on a very young human being who, A, doesn't know anything different, who can't speak up, and B, who is going to take these learned behaviors with them into adulthood and try to navigate with this fractured sense of family. So I think we need to call it what it is. Children of divorce do not have a family. They have something else. They have adults who love them, but they don't really have a family, because a family is one. A family is a unity. children of divorce do not have that.
Well, and if so much of the impetus behind widespread divorce is the idea that this is liberating, liberation becomes kind of addictive. Every generation wants to be liberated from something, but as the thing that you're being liberated from becomes less and less cohesive, then eventually it just becomes nihilism. It becomes nothingness. And so there's a multiplier effect. You have the generation now, the millennials, who grew up, this is their the second or third generation of mass divorce. And when they grow up and they want to rebel against containing strictures, they're basically just become these atomized individuals who have no connection to anything. I mean, it really is very tragic. And I don't think that you can develop emotionally without a strong sense of home, without there being a sense that when you're a child, there are these people who love you unconditionally, and their home is your home, and that's a place where you go and you're safe. And I think that step-parent blended families compromise that on a certain level. Not in all cases, as you say, and I don't want to discredit, widows and widowers or women who have to get out of marriages because they're being abused or they've been abandoned. I don't want to discredit those people, but we have to be honest. And I think we almost have to honor widows and abandoned and abused women also for the pain that they've gone through. If your beginning argument is saying that the original natural family doesn't matter and you can break it down on will, you're erasing the pain, are you not, of people who have lost a spouse or people who have lost a parent? Isn't that kind of denying them pain?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I like to approach it like this. I always try to locate the impetus of the problem. So if the impetus does not reside with the custodial adult or adults, then I think it's a safe bet that if the family broke down, then they're not to be held responsible. So if you're a woman and your husband dies, then that's why the dad is not in the child's life. The woman is not responsible for that. Okay, it's an injustice. It's painful. But the impetus doesn't lie with the mother who has custody of the child. Whereas, say, for example, in a surrogacy, a third-party reproduction arrangement, then, the impetus lies with the adult who will be acquiring custody of the child. So, in my opinion, they are to be held responsible for the fracturing of the child's, tie with his cultural and genetic roots.
Yeah, and I mean, and the child knows the difference. That's the thing, is that people try to make it seem as though if you just can barrage people with enough children's books, barrage them with enough cartoons on Nickelodeon and enough Walt Disney, subliminal messages, that somehow kids will grow up and not see that the people raising them were the cause of a major fracturing in their identity. I think the reality is that kids will know. They will know that something is wrong and that the people who are raising them were the ones who really made that decision,
Well, I really hope that all of us adults, children who've had to undergo this, and then all of the new kids who are undergoing it, I hope that we'll really get our courage and start speaking out about it loudly and clearly. I think that we have had to, we've been forced to embrace, I think, some new taboos. So, we're not really allowed to criticize our parents' quote-unquote sexual liberty or their sexual choices because our culture upholds sexual liberty so highly. But if you call that into question, well, then you're kind of breaking a cultural taboo, I think. So, and cultural taboos are hard to break. So I think that's one reason why more people are not speaking out against it. I think also the institutionalization of feminism adds a new wrinkle to it, because 80% of divorces are filed by women. Overwhelmingly, it's women who kick men out of the house and then want custody of the child, and then typically keep the child away from their own father. And we can't criticize that because there's this whole layer of feminist pundits and commentators and educators and lawyers who make it seem like it's sexist for us to criticize this trend. And the difficult thing about that is I think it's really demeaning to women to assume that every single woman who files for divorce really is doing this because she as a woman needs to be liberated. I mean, women have good and bad among them just like men, right? I mean, what do you think about that? Oh, yeah. Well, I think that one thing that never really gets discussed is that the category of license really does not come up in these conversations. So we have liberty, there's this paradigm, liberty versus license. And nobody really talks about license anymore. So I think that if your liberty is creating negative effects on somebody in your life who cannot escape from those effects, then I would say that your liberty is not really liberty, it's probably license.
Right, yeah.
I would like to see the whole concept of license resurrected and brought into these discussions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a really good point. I want to thank you very, very much for joining me, and I hope that we can continue to stay in contact. This was a really interesting discussion. I think it's something that we need to develop further. Are there any websites or any resources that listeners can go to if they want to follow up on the work that you're doing or support the Ruth Institute?
Yeah, they could go to ruthinstitute.org and sign up for our newsletter, and they also get a free download when they do that, free PDF download. They can go to our Facebook page at our Ruth Institute Facebook page and follow us there. We have content that appears on our Facebook page that doesn't necessarily show up on our blog or on our website. So that would be really great.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Bobby.
All right. Bye-bye.
You've just been listening to Jennifer Johnson and Dr. Robert Oscar Lopez discussing divorce, freedom, and family on his podcast, Cogwatch. Our website is www.ruthinstitute.org, and we're also on Facebook. Like the Ruth Institute or Dr. Jennifer Roback Moore's pages for updates. Our podcasts can be found online at ruthinstitute.org and iTunes, and as always, they're under a Creative Commons license. If you've enjoyed them, please share them with friends. The Ruth Institute is a non-profit educational organization devoted to bringing hope and encouragement for lifelong married love and healing within the family.